Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the monthly Heikin-Ashi candles. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, oftentimes when people look at the Bitcoin chart, or we look at any chart, it's natural to look at the candles that you see on your screen, right? Fairly normal looking chart, and you essentially have the open and the close dictating the color scheme, or the color, I should say, of that candle. So for instance, last month, Bitcoin opened at 20,493 and back in early November, but it closed at 17,167. Therefore, because the closing price was lower than the opening price, it ends up being a red candle. And the wick is the highest price for that month, and the wick to the upside was the highest price that month. The wick to the low side was the lowest price that month. Fairly straightforward. This is what most people use, right? This is what most people use. But we have done videos before where we look at the monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, and we look at the weekly Heikin-Ashi candles, and I want to go through a little bit of how they can be useful. So if you go up here on TradingView and you just switch this over from candles to the Heikin-Ashi candles, it looks something like this. And you might notice that it looks very different from the candles we were just looking at. Again, just to see this bear market, according to normal candles, we've got some red, then we got some green, and in between, still more red, green, red, right? It's just all over the place. The Heikin-Ashi candles just say, not really. It's just been a bear market since December, right? Since December. Now, you might wonder, how are these colors chosen? Well, one thing to first consider is that with normal candles, they only care about the price during that time period, right? So like during that month. But Heikin-Ashi candles actually care about data from before. For instance, and we're going to go through the close, right? So the closing price for the Heikin-Ashi is not just whatever the closing price is on that day. And you might say, well, why wouldn't you want to have it like that, right? Why wouldn't you want to have it just on that, what was actually at the close? Well, one could argue that it's just so noisy and irrelevant, right? Like, why does it matter so much what the price was at some random time on a random day that, us humans have defined as important, right? Why do we care so much about that? But instead, what if we say the close is equal to 1/4, right? 1/4 of, and then we have several different things, right? We have the open plus the close. So it takes into account the close, but it's not just based on the close, right? Plus the low and the high. So plus, if I can write these pluses down, plus the high and plus the low. So this right here is how the close is defined with the Heikin-Ashi candles. You may notice that last month in November, it shows the close at 18,675. However, we know that's not actually where Bitcoin closed. If you go to what most candles or most people look at, you can see the close was actually at 17,167. Okay, so that is how the actual close is defined, right? It sort of looks weird because it's like, wow, the close is a function of the close, but it's just how the Heikin-Ashi candle is defined. It actually takes into account whatever the close was for that time period. Perhaps I should try to use the text for the next one. So we also have the open, which is a very similar type of thing, but it's equal to just 1/2 of the open of the previous bar. So this is why I'm saying like it actually depends on previous information, right? Like it's not only dependent on the information from that candle, it's also important what the prior candle was, right? So it's 1/2 the open of the previous bar plus the close of the previous bar, right? So you have 1/2 open of the previous bar plus the close of the previous bar. And perhaps we can just quickly move on. I mean, I could rewrite this one, I suppose, but let's just move on. So the next one I want to do is the high, right? So there's the high, and that's just the maximum, right, of the high or the open or the close, right? So it's just whatever's the highest out of all of those. Now you might say, well, wouldn't the max of what's in here just be equal to the high, right? That would be the highest one. Well, no, remember, the open is dependent on a previous candle. So it's theoretically possible for the open to actually be higher than what the high was for that month, because the high for that month could actually be lower than the average of the open of the previous bar and the close of the previous bar. I know this is somewhat convoluted, but there's a purpose to all of this, right? And then we also have the low, which in a similar fashion is just equal to the min of the low, the open, and the close. Okay, so we have these three things, and I mean, you can see just how, and perhaps just for the sake of it, I will rewrite this one just so it looks a little bit cleaner, right? So you also have the close equals 1/4 the high plus the low plus the open plus the close, which is the average, right? I mean, you could phrase it like 1/4 of all this, or you could just say it's the average of everything, right? Because you have 4 separate things, you're dividing it by 4. This is 2 separate things, you're dividing it by 2, so it's just the average of those values. So this is how these are actually defined. So now at least you know, okay? I mean, if you don't care about this stuff, I suppose you could have just fast forwarded through that part. Maybe I should have told you that earlier. Oh, well. But anyways, this is how these candles are actually defined. Now, the reason why this is important is because we can actually learn something from the way the candles actually end up closing. Okay, so strong uptrends and bull markets are characterized by large candle bodies, upper shadows, but no lower shadows, right? What did you notice back in, during this bull market? You have a lot of large candle bodies. You mostly have overshadows where you see wicks to the upside, but you don't really see many wicks to the downside. There's a couple back in September and October of 2020. That was when we were retesting the bull market support band as support. So it makes sense, right? Just scare everyone one more time before we go up. We had the Gap Boys back then calling for 9,600 Bitcoin. Basically, Bitcoin told them off by going to 9,800, and then after going to 9,800, then blasting off to 64K within a few months, leaving the Gap Boys behind, at least for that cycle. And so, if you look at this is a fairly strong uptrend, okay? And then, this cycle sort of played all sorts of games with us, right? We had the flip. And by the way, I mean, from a technical perspective, most indicators flipped bearish here, right? Most technical indicators flipped bearish there. But we did manage to go up one last time. It's interesting because, there were a lot of people that were bearish right here, including myself. And I got bullish back in the summer, but I think for the wrong reasons. In hindsight, I think the reasons that I got bullish right here were actually incorrect. And there was probably more reason to be bearish, and we still went up, and then we came back down, and it took me until somewhere in right over here to actually realize that the party was over. But one of the things to consider here is that in the bull market you see large candle bodies, upper shadows, but really no or few lower shadows or under shadows, right? And I mean, you can see this throughout other bull markets as well, right? For the most part, you see large candle bodies, upper shadows, and very few or no lower shadows, right? What did the bear market look like, right? Well, what does the bear market look like? Well, you can kind of see. It's mostly large candle bodies, under shadows, or lower shadows, whatever you want to call them, but no upper shadows or very few of them. You can see there was an upper shadow here, but you often get that when the trend reverses. Not always, but you typically will see something like that. You can see it happen here and here. We also had a couple upper shadows back over here during the bear market rally back in Q1. We also just saw another upper shadow here when everyone got faked out once again, and a lot of people thought the bottom was in, but as we sort of surmised, it was in fact not, and people were falling for the same exact trap that they fell for back in 2018, right? Where you bottom in June, you put some local bottom in June, you then put in higher lows for several months, and then everyone thinks the bottom's in, and then we capitulate in November, right? It's the same exact thing that we saw in 2018. Same thing, right? I mean, the playbook was basically the exact same thing. Now, the events are slightly different, but the playbook is the exact same thing. And I will mention, try not to get so distracted by the drama, okay? Because it's a great way to sort of miss out on the next bull run, to just sort of assume that this drama is it's out to get you or whatever. I mean, this stuff is, we have it every bear market, right? I mean, it happens every bear market. And if you let it get to you too much, then you're going to likely miss out on the next bull market. Okay, so try to keep that in mind. Try not to let it affect you too much. But what you notice, right? Got a lot of large candle bodies going down, very few upper shadows. There's a real strategy to be said, right? I mean, a real strategy. And we've talked about this before. I mean, look at, go back and look at the prior videos we did on Heikin-Ashi candles. There's a real strategy to be said of someone who simply buys when it turns green and sells when it turns red. Buys when it turns green, sells when it turns red, right? I mean, like, you're not necessarily going to time the top and the bottom exactly. Probably beats the hell out of a lot of strategies, though, if you think about it. I mean, and the reason why it might actually be difficult for a lot of people to sort of do this type of strategy is because by the time you get a green monthly Heikin-Ashi candle, it's likely going to be well off the low, right? So like if you go back over here and you look at, April of 2019, by the time this flipped green, so you would not have had confirmation of that until May of 2019. By the time that actually occurred, if you actually go look at where Bitcoin was back in May, you would have bought Bitcoin at around $5,000. Now, that might have felt bad because you were well off the low, right? To the tune of 66%, it doesn't mean it would have been a bad trade, right? It still would have been a good trade because then Bitcoin went up to $14,000 or so. So again, I mean, it's one of these things where, sometimes these sort of more simple strategies are at least worth paying attention to and saying, you know what, it's hard to time things exactly, but trends like this have at least provided something. Now, has it always worked? No, it hasn't, right? If you go back further, you can see there are certainly times where, you see a fake out, right? Where you might go up. This is a 2013 bull market, and you see some red, and if you think that's the end of it, well, you got completely faked out, right? So it does not always work. There's also sort of like a fake out right here, and then maybe a brief fake out in here. But interestingly enough, for the majority of the last two bull markets and bear markets, you can see it provided a fairly clear signal, right? Like when you start to see these things turn green like this and you just get one after another, you might feel like you're FOMOing in, but the reality is even though Bitcoin might be up, it still could be down 70, 80% from the all-time high, right? So you have to consider that when thinking about these Heikin-Ashi candles. Now, I will be clear about something. This is not a strategy. I mean, I don't use waiting for it to flip green or red to decide whether I'm buying or selling. I'm just saying, if you wanted to incorporate it as part of your strategy, I don't really think there's anything wrong with that. For instance, back in 2018, like I was still a buyer here at 3K, but I was also a buyer at 6K, right? So take that for what it's worth. I was also a buyer at 6K, and I was a buyer at 3K. And then eventually, both of these trades were eventually in profit, but it did take some time. And so now, we find ourselves where we just had an upper shadow, a very small one, but now we find ourselves in a month without an upper shadow so far. Now, of course, the month just started, but it would take actually quite a move to the upside to even see an upper shadow on this monthly candle. I mean, again, the top part of this is already at around 19.8K. I mean, that would be quite a rally for Bitcoin. I'm not saying it can't do it, but it would take quite a substantial rally to see a wick above sort of the top of this monthly candle. So as long as, we don't close above the midpoint from the prior candle, right? As long as we don't close above that, then we're still looking at a fairly bearish Heikin-Ashi candle, right? Now, if you go look at what happened in the 2018 bear market, you will notice, in fact, that the candle before we actually turned green, we did see an upper shadow, right? We saw an upper shadow. So those are at least somewhat, worth paying attention to, right? This one's a bit more, I would argue this was a bit more bullish than this one, mainly because, it's a very small candle body, really showing that the trend was, likely coming to an end. What you'll also notice, and I think this is an interesting thing as well, is that if you look at the length at which we've seen, let's just sort of count them up, okay? How many Heikin-Ashi monthly red candles did it take for Bitcoin to start the bull run to the new all-time high, okay? So what I mean by that is how long did it take to get to the green section that took us to new highs? And how many of those monthly candles were red? Well, you can start here, right? And notice if you just look at 1, it's 0. And if you look at 2, it's 1. So we just have to remember to add 1. So that was 13. So 14 reds. We then had 4 more, right? And then 2 more. So 6 plus 14. So it took 20 red monthly Heikin-Ashi candles to begin the bull market that took us to new highs. Now, you could argue it only took us 14 of these monthly ones before the bottom was decisively in, and it actually, was less than that. But you could say, okay, until we actually had that bull market that took us to new highs, it took about 20 red monthly Heikin-Ashi candles. Now, back over here in 2014, you can see we had 4 here, and then here we had 10, because it's 1 more, right? So that's 14, 15, 16, and then we did have 1 red one. I don't know if you really want to include that one, but we had about, let's say 15, 16, something like that, red monthly Heikin-Ashi candles before we got into the bull run that just led us to the new all-time highs. The reason why it's difficult to say that this was, this was a pretty big pullback that took us all the way back down near the low, right? So I do think that's at least somewhat important to consider. It was certainly didn't really feel like a bull market in March of 2020 when we were, sitting back below $4,000, right? It didn't really feel like a bull market. But certainly what came after it did. Now, so far, this one, we're looking at 13, right? It's 1 more, so 12. We have 13 in a row. If you want to throw these in here as well, you could say we have 16. My guess is that, if you look at this as a whole and you sort of look at the overall trends in Bitcoin, what you'll notice is that we tend to get, these year-long bear markets. They can sometimes last more than a year, okay? One common thing I see is, well, has Bitcoin bottomed? I've seen this question literally all year long, right? Has Bitcoin bottomed? And I've said the same thing throughout the entire year, right? There's really no sense in spending too much time thinking about the bottom for Bitcoin in 2022. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but what's likely going to happen is the people that call for the bottom throughout the year are likely just going to be making a fool of themselves because it's a bear market, and while things might seem like they're just going to go up, typically when you give a bear market long enough, we just go ahead and put in new lows. That's the same thing that happened, in November after a lot of people thought that June was the bottom, for basically half a year. So, and I don't really think it's that concerning anyways. I mean, most people aren't going to buy the bottom anyways, so you really shouldn't spend too much time thinking about it regardless. But what you'll notice, and I think this is the important part, is that after the bear market is over, right, after the final low is in, you still don't really start the bull market right away. This is an important thing to consider, right? So even if you celebrate the bottom being in, whenever that might be, right? Whether you think the bottom's already in, or maybe in a month, or maybe in 2 months, or whatever it might be, right? Even if you get to that point where you feel like you can celebrate the bottom being in because, all of your indicators have hit and it kind of seems like the recession is maybe behind us or whatever it might be, you have to remember we still tend to go sideways for a long time, before getting back into a bull market. Now, we should talk about that a little bit because, if I were making videos back in 2018, I didn't start till 2019. I started in right around here. I think it was like, sometime during this sort of like brief bear market that we had back in sort of mid to late 2019. That's when I started really making videos on my channel. But if I were to have told you in 2018 that Bitcoin's just going to go sideways for a year, right? Before we get a new bull market, and then we went up 4x. I mean, you probably would have thought, well, what's been smoking, right? He said we were going to go sideways for a year, and then Bitcoin went up 4x. That's why I should say, when you sort of talk about what does even sideways mean, moves up 100% or something, or even 200%, could still, I think, be characterized as somewhat sideways for an asset that can go up 20x in a bull market and drop 80% or more in a bear market. Okay? So for instance, let's suppose that this sort of bear market finalizes in the coming months, and you see Bitcoin at like, I don't know, let's say 13K or so. I don't know, right? I mean, it just depends on how bad things get, but I mean, certainly there's a chance we could go lower. If Bitcoin were to then go back up to 26K or 30K even, right? Like if it were to do something like, let me draw this out. I'm trying to figure out where that. So let's suppose Bitcoin did something like this. Some people might look at this and say that this is not sideways if it can go up like that. But I would still say that that's very much, that's very much sideways. It's still, to me, this would be still sideways price action, where you basically go into sort of just like a long choppy range where you're not really getting any real attempts at taking out the new all-time high. You're just sort of moving up and down, and it's sort of like a trader's paradise, right? Where they buy at the range low and they sell at the range high. And this is what typically happens the year after a long bear market. And by the way, I mean, just a reminder, yes, the last bear market started in, say, like December of one year and then ended in December of the following year, back in 2017, 2018. We should remember that the 2013 bear market started in November and lasted until January of 2015. So it actually lasted about 14 months, not 12 months. Furthermore, there were some exchanges, not a lot of them, but there were some exchanges that put in a new low in August of 2015, which was well beyond, a year-long bear market, right? So I would still say that this bear market ended right here, right? But then you still had that sideways, you still had this sort of sideways range that lasted essentially from January 2015 until basically the end of 2015, right? If Bitcoin, this is a thought exercise I think about sometimes, right? If Bitcoin had put on a new low in March of 2020, like let's say it had gone down to lower than $3,000, I still think, and then like let's say that it had wicked down just a bit lower, right? Let's just say $3,000. Let's just say it wicked down just a bit lower, and then it had the same bull run. I don't know that we would look back at that and say that the bear market lasted all the way until here. We probably would have just said the bear market lasted until here, and then we sort of just had like a year-long sideways range. Just like there was technically a new low on this wick on some exchanges, but most people would say the bear market was over here, and then we just simply, went sideways for about a year. Some exchanges put in a new low, some did not. So that's why, I think it's somewhat relevant to think about that as we get into 2023, at some point, we're likely looking at some green in the monthly Heikin-Ashi candles. And if you go look at prior bear markets, in 2019, it took until April to see that green monthly Heikin-Ashi candle. So, I mean, if, that would be, if you were to make a comparison, you could argue like April of 2023. If you look at the 2015 bear market, it took until June to see any type of green on the monthly Heikin-Ashi candle, right? So June and April. Right now, we're still sitting in December. So if history is any indication, it could still take several months from this point before you see any green on the monthly Heikin-Ashi candles. And that green will be a welcome sight, I think, by a lot of crypto investors. I think it'll be a welcome sight because it'll show that finally there's some reprieve from this, this bear market that we've been in for quite a long period of time. But I do think that these monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, can be quite useful. And they're at least one of the reasons why I've remained bearish this year and I have not been calling for any type of bottom is because we have all sorts of indicators on the website, that suggested that back in the summer that 17.5 was not the bottom. But furthermore, you look at trends like this, and until you see the bulls really put up a fight, it's hard to sort of ring the victory bell and the bottom being in. It's just hard to do something like that. But if you see something like this, right, where you start to see this sort of bottoming pattern, and then you see a little bit of hope, right, where you get a really small candle body and an upper shadow, then we can really start to consider, right, that the trend is changing. But the point that I've said is that, a lot of people spend the entire year looking for reasons that the bear market is over and all that sort of stuff. When in reality, if you just looked at some of these overall trends in the market and these large candle bodies and really no to few upper shadows, it kind of just says it's just a bear market, and you should remain cautious and you should remain defensive, and eventually the trend will change. And if you wait until the trend changes to buy Bitcoin, you'll probably miss the bottom, right? You probably will. Maybe people don't care about that, right? Or maybe you're already buying and you just sort of recognize it could go lower before the final bottom is actually in. So, I think it's somewhat relevant. And again, it's sort of as a defense to the people that might just wait for the green to form. Their defense could be something like, well, let's say it comes down here and then finally we get some green by mid 2023 and they're buying Bitcoin at $17,000 as opposed to maybe whatever the bottom was. Maybe the bottom's at 13K, maybe it's 14K, or maybe it was 15K. Their defense could be, well, it was better than buying every single dip along the way, right? That could be a counter argument to such a strategy. But anyways, these are the monthly Heikin-Ashi candles for Bitcoin. Hopefully you find them useful. If just for interest, if you're curious what the weekly looks like, this is what it looks like, right? You can clearly see these bear market rallies. That's all they've been, are bear market rallies, nothing more, nothing less. We've had several of them this year, and every single time people get excited, and every single time they were just a bear market rally. You can also look at quarterly candles, which I think is interesting to look at. The reason is because what you'll notice is that this bear market, we had 4 3-month Heikin-Ashi candles in a row, right? Before we started to show green. And once we showed green, it was all systems go. The last bear market, we showed 4, right? We showed 4. We still got 2 more later on. Right? So here we had 3, right? So here we had 3. Here we had, it's hard to draw on this because it sort of lines it up to the grid or whatever. Here we had 3, here we had 4, and then here we had 6 before we actually, really got into the bull market. But you'll notice that the last 2 had 4. So is there a possibility that Q1, is there a possibility that, we could get into Q1 or Q2 and we could see some green? Yeah, I think so. I think there's a decent chance that quarterly candle coming up will in fact finally sort of flip back the other way. Doesn't mean you can't see more red before the next bull market, but just an interesting way to look at it. And then also we can look at 6 months. If you look at 6 months, this is what it looks like. So here you had 3 6 months in a row that were red. Here you had, this one was sort of just all over the place. Here we've had 2, and then it's always interesting, I think, to look at the ones on the yearly. And this is actually another good way to understand the Heikin-Ashi candles, because it doesn't even show 2014 or 2018 as being red, right? It shows 2014 as green, 2018 is green. It shows the next ones as being red because, again, it takes the average from the prior 2 to really help define what the next yearly Heikin-Ashi candle is, right? So it shows this one being red, 2015, and it shows 2019 being red. What's interesting about that? Those 2 years being red. Those were the accumulation years, right? 2015 was the accumulation year. 2019 was the accumulation year. Maybe you see another red candle here, monthly Heikin-Ashi candle in 2023. That's red. Could be another accumulation year, right? Before another bull market. So just something to consider. Hopefully you guys like this story about Heikin-Ashi candles, and it's provided another perspective on the space that you maybe didn't otherwise have. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye.